In a freezing night, a poor young woman huddled beside her dying fire, trying to forget how empty her cabin felt. Then came the sound, desperate pounding on her door that made her heart stop. She grabbed the nearest weapon and froze. Every instinct screamed danger. But through the frosted glass, she saw him, a strange man, cradling a small, trembling child. She should have turned away. She should have locked every bolt and prayed they'd leave. But the little girl coughed, weak, rattling, desperate, and something in Caroline shattered. What she didn't know as she opened that door was that this otherworldly stranger was Julius Vero, vampire king of the Northern Court, an immortal who had ruled in shadow for 8 centuries. And her one act of terrified compassion would drag her into a world where monsters wore faces of desperate fathers, where kindness was the rarest magic of all, and where her choice to see past fear would either destroy her or transform her into something far greater than she ever imagined. Before we continue, let us know in the comment section what time it is and where you are watching from. And remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the story. Now, let's continue. The wind didn't just howl. It screamed, tearing at the shutters of the isolated cabin on Widow's Peak Road like something alive and furious. Then the pounding started. Sharp, violent, relentless. Caroline's hand shot to the kitchen knife on the table, her knuckles going white around the handle. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she stared at the door, every muscle locked tight. The pounding came again, each strike echoing through the small space like a drumbeat of doom. Please. The voice cut through the storm, deep, cultured, edged with something that sounded like centuries of control finally breaking. Please, my daughter is dying. The words sent ice down Caroline's spine. Her mind flashed back instantly. Another storm, another desperate voice, another stranger she'd foolishly trusted. By morning, her mother's jewelry and her hidden savings were gone. The police did nothing. The betrayal did everything. She'd sworn, never again. But then she heard it. A child's cough, weak and wet and rattling. A sound no one could fake. Caroline's grip on the knife trembled. Through the frosted window, a dark figure moved, bent over something impossibly small. She crept closer, breath coming in shallow gasps, torn between the screaming voice of survival and the whisper of her mother's last lesson. We help because we're human, Caroline. The moment we stop, we become the monsters. She peered through the ice-crusted glass. The man shifted, and suddenly she could see the child, limp, feverish, her small face slack against his shoulder. But it was him that made Caroline's blood run cold. Platinum hair plastered to his skull. Skin so pale it seemed to glow against the darkness. Eyes that caught the cabin's firelight and reflected it back like a predator's. I'm begging you. His voice cracked, raw with desperation and something older, darker. She's burning up. I have nowhere else to go. Caroline stood frozen, every rational thought screaming to walk away. But her hand was already moving toward the bolt. One shaking breath. One impossible choice. She turned the lock. The door opened. The storm rushed in like a living thing, and with it came Julius Vero and his dying daughter, stepping across her threshold and into her life, bringing with them secrets that would shatter everything she thought she knew about monsters, magic, and the terrible, beautiful price of compassion. The cold hit like a physical blow as Julius stumbled inside, snow cascading from his shoulders. Caroline slammed the door shut and locked it, the knife still gripped behind her back, her eyes never leaving him. He moved to the fire with a grace that was wrong, too fluid, too silent, and laid the child on the threadbare couch with a gentleness that seemed impossibly practiced. Don't move, Caroline said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'll get blankets. She returned with her mother's old quilt and a bowl of soup she'd been heating. Julius wrapped Elena carefully, murmuring in a language that sounded like whined through ancient stones. Caroline set the soup on the small table, watching him. He didn't even glance at it. His entire focus was on the child, checking her forehead, her pulse, adjusting the blanket with trembling fingers that moved too fast, too precisely. "You should eat," Caroline offered, testing the waters. His answer was immediate, distracted. He never looked away from Elena, his hand pressing gently against her flushed cheek as she whimpered in her sleep. Caroline's gaze drifted to the old mirror hanging above the mantel. In its warped surface, she could see the firelight, the couch, the child's flushed face. But where Julius knelt, nothing. Just empty space where a man should be. Her breath caught. The knife felt impossibly heavy in her hand, but the question died on her lips as she watched him adjust Elena's blanket for the third time, his movements desperate, paternal, utterly focused on keeping his daughter alive. Whatever he was, whatever impossibility had crossed her threshold tonight, he was suffering. And she knew that kind of fear, the terror of watching someone you love slip away while you're powerless to stop it. "We were traveling," Julius said suddenly, his voice rough, "to find someone who could help her. The storm came too fast. I had no choice but to." He stopped, jaw tight with something that looked like shame. "I had no choice but to beg." Caroline understood begging. She understood desperation. Her mother had died alone, having given everything for someone who valued nothing. Julius looked at her then, really looked, and something passed between them, an understanding forged in loss, in the unbearable weight of choosing compassion when the world punishes it. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect from someone who probably bowed to no one. The hours bled together in firelight and shadow. Elena's breathing came in shallow gasps, her small body twisting beneath the quilt as fevered dreams chased her through sleep. She murmured words Caroline couldn't understand, some in English, some in that same ancient language Julius had spoken earlier. Each time the child whimpered, Julius tensed like a bowstring ready to snap. Caroline brought tea twice. The first time, Julius accepted the cup with a murmured thanks and set it on the floor, untouched. The second time, she watched as he raised it to his lips but never actually drank, just held it there until the steam stopped rising, then placed it aside with the same careful precision he did everything else. "You haven't eaten. You won't drink." Caroline settled into the chair across from him, exhaustion making her bold. "What are you really?" Julius was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on Elena's forehead, checking her temperature for the 100th time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "Something old. Something that shouldn't exist anymore, and certainly shouldn't be begging mortals for mercy." He glanced at her, and in the firelight his features looked carved from marble, beautiful and terrible and impossibly sad. "But I'm also a father, and right now, that's the only thing that matters." The answer was evasive, but Caroline let it hang there. She'd seen the empty space in the mirror. She'd watched him move like shadow and silk. Whatever truth he was skirting, she wasn't sure she was ready to hear it spoken aloud. Not yet, not while her world was already tilting sideways. "How long have you been her father?" she asked instead, choosing safer ground. His expression softened, just slightly. "Long enough to have forgotten what I was before she existed." He smoothed Elena's damp hair back from her forehead with infinite care. "She gave me something I thought I'd lost centuries ago." "What's that?" "A reason to be afraid." His smile was slight, painful. "Fear means you have something worth losing." Caroline understood that better than she wanted to. She'd spent a year building walls specifically so she'd never have to feel that terror again, the fear of opening yourself to loss. Yet here she sat, in a cabin with a creature who admitted to being something inhuman and a dying child she didn't know, feeling that old familiar ache of caring despite every logical reason not to. Her eyes grew heavy. The warmth of the fire, the endless adrenaline finally crashing, the strange comfort of shared vigil, it all pulled her down. She tried to fight it, but her body had other plans. When she woke, hours later, the fire had burned low. Elena's breathing had evened out slightly, her fever finally breaking. And draped across Caroline's shoulders was Julius's heavy cloak, still carrying the cold of the storm but offered with a kindness that made her throat tight. He sat exactly where he'd been before, watching over his daughter, but his eyes flicked to Caroline for just a moment, a silent acknowledgement of trust given and, perhaps, returned. Morning came pale and quiet. The storm had spent its fury, leaving behind a world buried in white silence. Caroline woke stiff in the chair, Julius's cloak sliding from her shoulders as she stood. Through the frosted window, snow had drifted halfway up the door. They weren't going anywhere today. Julius was at the window, examining the broken latch that had rattled all night. His fingers moved with impossible precision. No fumbling, no hesitation, and within seconds the mechanism that Caroline had struggled with for months clicked smoothly into place. He tested it once, twice, then nodded as if he'd been doing such things for lifetimes. Because he probably had.
Papa.
Elena's voice was small but clearer than it had been. The fever flush had faded from her cheeks, leaving her pale but lucid. Julius was beside her instantly, his hand on her forehead, relief flooding his ancient features. "I'm here, little star. How do you feel?" "Tired, but better." Elena's eyes found Caroline, and she smiled shyly. "Thank you for helping us." "You're welcome," Caroline said, something warming in her chest despite everything strange and frightening about this situation. Elena sat up slowly, accepting the water Julius offered. Her gaze drifted around the small cabin with a peculiar intensity, as if she were seeing more than walls and furniture. "Papa says you have a kind soul," she said suddenly. "I can see it. It glows gold, like the light from your door last night." Caroline froze. "You can see that?" "Elena sees many things others cannot," Julius said quietly, a warning and an explanation all at once. The girl was already reaching for the scrap paper and pencil Caroline kept by the fire. Her small hands moved quickly, sketching the cabin with surprising skill, but in her drawing, golden light poured from the doorway like sunlight, spilling out into the darkness, warm and welcoming and alive. Later, Caroline watched through the window as Julius split wood behind the cabin. The axe moved like an extension of his body. Effortless, rhythmic, each log splitting with a single precise strike that shouldn't have been possible. But it was the way he worked that struck her most. The careful stacking, the attention to the grain, the practiced economy of someone who'd done this simple human task across centuries. Not a monster performing a chore, but a person who'd chopped wood in 100 winters, in 100 different lives. When he came back inside, snow dusting his platinum hair, arms full of firewood, Caroline saw him clearly for the first time. Not the impossible creature, without a reflection. Not the desperate father who'd begged at her door. But something in between, ancient and lonely and utterly devoted to the small girl who'd given him back his humanity. "Thank you," she said, and meant it for more than just the wood. Julius met her eyes, and for a moment the weight of centuries lifted. "No," he said softly. "Thank you." By afternoon, the sound of plows echoed in the distance. The main road was being cleared. Julius stood at the window, watching the orange truck work its way along the valley, and Caroline saw the shift in his posture, the straightening of shoulders, the return of something regal and remote that hadn't been there when he was simply a terrified father. "We'll leave before nightfall," he said quietly. Elena was sitting by the fire, color fully returned to her cheeks, sketching another picture. The road will be passable by then. Caroline should have felt relief. Instead, she felt the sharp edge of unfinished business pressing against her ribs. "Before you go," she said, surprised by her own boldness, "I need to know what you are. The truth this time." Julius turned from the window, and the weight of his gaze made her want to step back. But she held her ground. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if she'd passed some invisible test. "My name is Julius Varro. Was Vampire King of the Northern Court. I've ruled for 8 centuries. The words fell between them like stones into still water. "I am exactly what you feared when you saw me in that mirror." The world tilted. Caroline's hand found the back of the chair, gripping it hard enough to hurt. Vampire. The word ricocheted through her mind, bringing with it every nightmare she'd ever dismissed as fiction. "You." Her voice came out strangled. "You could have killed me. I let you in. I slept while you were here. You could have." "I could have," Julius said evenly. "I didn't. That's not good enough." Rage flooded through her terror, hot and sharp. "You lied to me. You used me. You made me think." She couldn't finish, couldn't articulate the betrayal of believing she'd seen humanity in him when all along he was something that shouldn't exist. "I didn't lie." His voice was quiet but firm. "Everything I told you was true. I am a father. I was desperate. My daughter was dying." He moved closer, and Caroline forced herself not to flee. "What I didn't tell you was what I am. Because you offered help when you saw a father and a sick child, not a vampire king. That innocence, that purity of intention, it's rarer than you know, Caroline. It's what began to heal Elena." "What?" "Her condition has no cure in my world. The only medicine that works is genuine human warmth. Human compassion offered freely, without fear or obligation or knowledge of what we are." His expression softened with something like sorrow. "Your kindness, your humanity, it saved her life." Caroline sank into the chair, her mind spinning. "So, I was just medicine? A tool?"
"No."
The word was sharp, almost pained. "You were the first mortal in 8 centuries to see past what I appear to be, and offer help anyway. That gift is beyond price." He reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed letter, the red wax stamped with a symbol that seemed to shift in the firelight, ancient and powerful and somehow alive. "If you ever need me, burn this. Anywhere, anytime. I will come. I don't want. You saved my daughter's life." Julius pressed the letter into her trembling hands, his fingers cold against hers. "That debt is eternal. Whether you want it or not, Caroline, you have the protection of the Northern Court. And more than that, you have my word." Elena appeared at his side, slipping her small hand into his. She looked at Caroline with those 2 knowing eyes and smiled. "Thank you for seeing us," she said softly. Then they were gone, the door closing behind them, leaving Caroline alone with a sealed letter and the terrifying knowledge that monsters were real, and she'd just invited one into her home. Caroline watched them disappear down the snowy road until they were nothing but dark shapes against white, then gone entirely. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, the letter heavy in her hand, the wax seal seeming to pulse with heat against her palm. Vampire King. The words kept circling through her mind like vultures. She'd let something impossible into her home. Something that could have torn her throat out while she slept. The thought made her stomach turn. She didn't think. She just moved to the fire and threw the letter in. The wax seal hissed as it caught, and for a moment Caroline could have sworn she heard a distant sound, like a door closing somewhere far away. Then there was nothing but ash and the sick relief of having severed that impossible connection. 3 weeks later, the eviction notice came. Caroline stared at the paper with numb disbelief. Back rent, 3 months, she'd thought she had more time to catch up on. The landlord's patience had finally run out. She had 30 days. 2 days after that, Marcus at the general store called her into his office, wearing the expression of a man about to kick a dog. Restructuring, he said, not meeting her eyes. Corporates cutting hours. Last hired, first let go. She cleaned out her locker in silence, her hands shaking. The truck died on a Tuesday. The mechanic gave her the news with genuine sympathy. Seized engine, more rust than metal, repair costs triple what the vehicle was worth. I can give you $200 for scrap, he offered. She took it. The money lasted a week. Then the power companies sent their final notice. Caroline sat in the growing darkness as the sun set, watching her breath mist in the cold cabin. One by one, she began pulling her mother's things from their careful storage, the porcelain figurines, the hand-stitched quilts, the silver candlesticks that had been in the family for generations. The pawn shop gave her a fraction of what they were worth. It still wasn't enough. When the power finally shut off, Caroline sat in absolute darkness, wrapped in the last quilt she couldn't bring herself to sell. The cold crept in like something alive, settling into her bones. She'd been so strong for so long, a year of building walls, of surviving, of refusing to break. She broke. The sobs came hard and ugly, tearing out of her chest like something wounded. She cried for her mother, for her pride, for the life she'd tried so desperately to hold together with willpower and stubbornness alone. And then, in the worst moment, she cried for the letter, that impossible, terrifying lifeline she'd burned in fear. Her hand found the cold fireplace, fingers scraping through old ash, as if she could somehow piece the letter back together from carbon and regret. But there was nothing. Just the grit of ash under her nails and the suffocating weight of having been given a gift and thrown it away. I'm sorry, she whispered to the darkness, to the vampire king who'd called his dead eternal, to the choice she'd made in terror that had left her utterly, completely alone. I'm so sorry. The cloak hung on the back of the door where Caroline had left it weeks ago, forgotten in the chaos of survival. She'd meant to give it back, but they'd left so quickly, and then she'd burned the letter, and then everything had fallen apart so fast there'd been no time to think about anything except the next catastrophe. Now, in the suffocating darkness, she pulled it down, needing something, anything, that held warmth. As she wrapped it around her shaking shoulders, her fingers caught on something stiff in the lining. A tear in the fabric. And inside, her breath stopped. Another letter, sealed with the same red wax, the same impossible symbol. Caroline stared at it for a long moment, her heart hammering. He'd left too. A backup, maybe. Or perhaps he'd known she might react exactly as she had, with fear and fire and the desperate need to sever anything that felt like obligation. For 3 days, the letter sat on the table while Caroline wrestled with herself. Pride whispered that she'd survived this long without help, that she could find another way, that accepting aid from something inhuman was a line she shouldn't cross. Fear screamed that inviting him back was insanity, that vampires didn't give gifts without strings, that she'd be trading one kind of debt for another far more dangerous. But hunger has a way of making philosophy irrelevant. On the third night, sitting in the dark with nothing left to sell and nowhere left to turn, Caroline's fingers found the seal. The wax was cold under her touch, but as she broke it, warmth flooded through the paper like a living thing. The letter burst into flames, not hot and consuming, but cold and silver blue, dancing in her palm without burning. And from the fire came Julius's voice, clear as if he stood beside her. I'm coming. The flames died. Caroline sat frozen, the letter crumbling to ash in her shaking hands, and wondered what she'd just done. He arrived within the hour. Caroline heard the car before she saw it. the smooth purr of an expensive engine that didn't belong on Widow's Peak Road. Then footsteps on the porch and a knock, polite and patient. She opened the door to find Julius standing in the moonlight, Elena beside him looking healthy and radiant, her cheeks full of color Caroline hadn't seen before. Behind them, a car idled, its trunk open and filled with boxes. Caroline's voice cracked. I burned the first one. I was afraid.
I'm sorry.
Stop. Julius's voice was gentle but firm. He gestured, and they began bringing boxes inside. Food, blankets, supplies that looked expensive and abundant. You helped us when we were strangers. When we were desperate and had nothing to offer but need. Now we return the kindness. He met her eyes, and there was no judgment there, only understanding. This is what honor demands, Caroline. Let us help. Elena set down a box of groceries and smiled at Caroline with those two wise eyes. Papa says pride is just fear wearing a crown. You don't have to wear it anymore. And standing in her dark, cold cabin, surrounded by impossible kindness from impossible creatures, Caroline finally let the crown fall. They ate together by candlelight, simple food that somehow tasted like salvation. Soup, bread, cheese that Elena had insisted on bringing because Miss Caroline needs proper food, Papa. Julius had started a fire, and for the first time in weeks, warmth crept back into the cabin's bones. Caroline told them everything. The words spilled out like a dam breaking. The eviction notice, with its cold 30-day deadline, Marcus's apologetic firing, the truck rusting in the mechanic's yard, her mother's belongings scattered across 3 different pawn shops. She told them about the darkness, the cold, the night she'd sat clutching ash and wishing she could unburn a letter written by a vampire king. Julius listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable in the firelight. Elena reached across the table and took Caroline's hand, her small fingers warm and steady. I'm terrified of being helpless again, Caroline admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Of needing people. Of being vulnerable. And now here you are, and I need your help so badly it makes me want to run. Then don't run, Julius said quietly.
Stay.
But not here. Caroline looked up, confused. I have a proposal. He leaned forward, his ancient eyes catching the firelight. There's a place, an estate that exists between worlds. Mortal and vampire. A sanctuary for those who don't fit cleanly into either realm. Half-mortal children like Elena. Vampires seeking refuge from court politics. Humans who've stumbled into our world and can't return to their old lives. It needs a keeper. Someone to run it, protect it, maintain the peace. I don't know anything about. The salary is substantial. Enough to rebuild your life 10 times over. The quarters are yours, a cottage on the grounds, private, comfortable. And the work. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The work is vital. These people, these beings, they have nowhere else to go. They need someone who understands what it means to exist between worlds, to not quite fit anywhere. Caroline stared at him, her mind reeling. Why me?
I'm nobody.
I'm just. You opened the door when every instinct told you not to. Julius's voice carried absolute certainty. You saw a sick child who needed help, not a vampire's daughter. You chose compassion over fear, kindness over safety. You looked at me, at what I am, and still offered shelter. He held her gaze. That's the only qualification that matters, Caroline. The sanctuary doesn't need someone who knows vampire politics or immortal protocols. It needs someone with a kind soul that glows gold. Elena was right about you. The weight of it pressed down on her, the impossibility, the responsibility, the sheer strangeness of being offered a job by a vampire king to protect creatures she'd thought were myths 3 weeks ago. I have conditions, Caroline said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Julius smiled slightly. I would expect nothing less. I run the sanctuary by my principles, my rules. I protect everyone equally, mortal, vampire, whatever they are. No one gets preferential treatment because of what they are or who they know. She met his eyes, refusing to look away. And you never use your power to influence my decisions.
No compelling, no manipulation, no vampire tricks.
If I'm going to do this, I need to know my choices are my own. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling fire. Then Julius extended his hand across the table, the gesture formal, binding. You have my word, he said, and the word of the Northern Court. The sanctuary will be yours to run as you see fit. I will be a resource, not a ruler. Your choices will always be your own. Caroline looked at his hand, pale, cold, belonging to something that shouldn't exist. Then she thought of the alternative: eviction, homelessness, selling the last pieces of her mother's memory for pennies. She thought of Elena's drawing, golden light spilling from a doorway. She thought of her mother's voice. We help because we're human. Maybe it was time to help herself. She took his hand. His grip was firm, cold, and somehow steadying. I accept. Elena clapped her hands together, beaming. You're going to be wonderful, Miss Caroline. I can already see the light growing brighter. And sitting in her Camelot cabin, making a deal with a vampire king to protect creatures from nightmare and fairy tale alike, Caroline felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. The sanctuary thrived beyond anything Caroline had imagined. Within 6 months, word had spread through whispered networks in both worlds. There was a place where half-mortal children could learn to control emerging abilities without shame, where vampires tired of courtly bloodshed could find redemption, where humans touched by the supernatural could finally speak their truth without being called insane. Caroline walked the grounds each morning, watching a half-fey girl teach a vampire child how to braid flower crowns, seeing a former assassin from the Eastern Court patiently tutoring human teenagers in history. The cottage Julius had promised became her anchor, but the sanctuary itself became her purpose. Then, on a frost-sharp November evening, they came. 7 figures emerged from the twilight like walking shadows, their presence making the air itself feel heavy. The Ancient Council. Caroline recognized their leader immediately from Julius's descriptions. Magistrate Corvus, tall and sharp as a blade, his eyes black and merciless as a winter sky. The sanctuary's residents scattered like startled birds. Only Julius stood firm, positioning himself between Caroline and the council, his posture rigid with barely controlled tension. Julius Vero, Corvus's voice cut through the silence like ice cracking. You stand accused of violating the separation doctrine. You have mixed mortal and immortal worlds, created a breeding ground for abominations, and weakened the purity of our kind. His gaze swept dismissively over the sanctuary. This ends tonight. The sanctuary closes. You abdicate, and you face judgment for your crimes. The only crime here is turning away those who need help, Julius said evenly, but Caroline could hear the edge beneath his control. You speak of help. We speak of order. Corvus turned his attention to Caroline, and she felt the weight of his gaze like frost on her skin. And you, mortal, you are the keeper of this travesty. Caroline lifted her chin, refusing to step back despite every instinct screaming at her to run. I am. Then I offer you a choice. Corvus moved closer, each step deliberate. Testify that Julius Vero coerced you into this position, that he used his power to manipulate your will, forced you to open these doors. Do this, and you will receive compensation beyond your imagination, enough wealth to live in luxury for 10 mortal lifetimes. You will be returned to your world, your memory adjusted, your life restored. He paused. Or stand with him and be marked as an enemy of the council. Forever hunted. Forever vulnerable. Forever caught between worlds with no protection. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Caroline's heart hammered against her ribs. Take the deal, Caroline. Julius's voice was quiet, strained. He wouldn't look at her. Save yourself. You owe me nothing. You never did. That's where you're wrong, Caroline said, and was surprised by the steadiness in her voice. She stepped forward, moving out from behind Julius's protective stance to face Corvus directly. I owe myself the truth. She turned to address the full council, these ancient beings who'd witnessed centuries while she'd barely lived 3 decades. Julius Vero never coerced me. He never used power on me, never manipulated me. He came to my door desperate and dying, carrying a sick child, and I chose to help. Later, when I had nothing, he offered me purpose. Not because he controlled me, but because he saw something in me I'd stopped seeing in myself. Her voice grew stronger. I've watched him sacrifice his comfort, his standing, maybe even his crown, all to protect his daughter and others who need sanctuary. I've seen him show more patience, more compassion, more genuine humanity than most mortals I've known. She met Corvus's cold gaze without flinching. If helping those who need it is a crime, then I'm guilty too. And I won't apologize for it. You would defend a monster? Corvus's voice dripped with disdain. I would defend a father, a protector, a person who chose kindness when power would have been easier. Caroline's hands trembled, but her voice held firm. If that makes me your enemy, so be it. Movement at the edge of the gathering. Elena stepped forward, her young face set with determination that made her look far older than her years. May I speak? Corvus waved a dismissive hand. A child has no voice in council matters. Even a child who is half mortal? Elena's words dropped like stones into still water. My mother was human. My father is vampire. I am both and neither, and for years I was dying because everyone told me I had to choose. That I couldn't be whole while being both. She moved to stand beside Caroline, taking her hand. My illness wasn't a disease. It was my own nature eating itself alive because I was taught that being different was wrong. The sanctuary saved me. Caroline saved me. She taught me that being different isn't a flaw or a crime. It's a gift. And now there are dozens of children here learning the same thing. Are you really going to tell them they're abominations? That they don't deserve a place to exist? Elena's voice cracked with emotion, but she didn't stop. Caroline saw my father as a person before she knew he was a king. She saw me as a child before she knew I was half mortal. That's not coercion. That's not manipulation. That's just being human in the way that matters most. The silence that followed felt different, heavier, weighted with something that might have been doubt. The council withdrew into shadow, their forms blurring at the edges as they conferred in voices too low and too ancient for mortal ears to comprehend. Caroline stood with Elena's hand gripped tightly in hers, Julius a silent pillar beside them, and waited for judgment that would reshape everything. When they returned, Corvus's expression remained carved from ice, unmoved and unyielding. But beside him, another figure stepped forward. Lady Serafini, her features elegant and timeless, her eyes holding something that might have been sympathy. The child's testimony carries weight, Serafini said, her voice like silk over steel. As does the mortal's courage. I vote to let the sanctuary stand. Sentiment has no place in cosmic order, Corvus countered coldly. And yet order without compassion is merely tyranny, Serafini replied. The council split, 3 for closure, 3 for protection. The tie hung in the air like a suspended blade. Then the eldest moved. Lord Erebus had been silent throughout, a figure so ancient he seemed more shadow than substance. When he spoke, his voice carried the dust of millennia. 8 centuries I have ruled beside Julius Varro. Never have I seen him show weakness until now. Erebus's gaze fixed on Julius with terrible intensity, and I realize his compassion was never weakness. It was the only strength that mattered. Let the sanctuary stand. Corvus's jaw tightened, but he bowed his head. Crossroads Sanctuary is granted protected status under council law. Then his cold gaze fixed on Julius. But there is still a price. Julius Varro, you are stripped of your title, your crown, your authority. You are no longer king. Julius stood perfectly still, centuries of power falling away like a discarded cloak. Then he smiled, genuine, unburdened, free. I accept without regret. Caroline saw the weight lift from his shoulders, the ancient weariness finally releasing its grip. He'd been a king for 800 years. Maybe it was time to simply be a father. 2 years later, the sanctuary thrived with over 100 residents. Caroline had become a bridge between worlds, respected by both mortal and immortal communities. Julius worked beside her as a counselor and teacher, no longer a king but something better, a gentle presence who taught vampire children to carve wood with infinite patience and helped traumatized mortals understand they weren't losing their minds. Elena had blossomed into a confident young woman, her dual nature now a source of strength. She ran programs for other half-mortal children, showing them through her own radiant existence that being different was a gift. On a quiet afternoon, Elena found Caroline and presented her with a new drawing, an elaborate map with the sanctuary at its center, and spreading outward like veins of light were golden threads, each one touching a life across both realms. Hundreds of connections, all beginning from a single illuminated doorway. This is what you've created, Elena said softly. Every person who found refuge here has gone on to help others. The light keeps spreading. Caroline traced the golden threads with trembling fingers, seeing what one terrified choice had become. That evening, as snow began to fall, Caroline stood in that same doorway, the threshold between worlds, between fear and hope. Through the window, she watched Julius kneeling beside a young vampire child, teaching him to shape wood, his patience infinite. She thought about the night he'd appeared, desperate, otherworldly, carrying a dying child. She'd been terrified. She'd had every reason to turn them away. And if she had, none of this would exist. Elena might have died. Julius would still be a lonely king. Caroline would still be alone in a cold cabin, surviving but not truly living. Opening that door hadn't just saved Elena. It had saved all of them. She'd learned that true courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was choosing kindness despite terror. That monsters and angels were defined by choices, not nature. That sometimes the most extraordinary magic in any world was simply seeing the person behind the impossible, the hope behind the fear, the father behind the fangs. Snow fell softly outside, and inside the sanctuary, golden light spilled from every window, warm, welcoming, alive. Caroline smiled as Elena joined Julius and the child, the three of them laughing over a lopsided wooden horse. She'd opened a door on a freezing night, and in doing so, she'd opened a world. If this story pulled you in, don't forget to like this video, drop your favorite scene in the comments, and subscribe. Tomorrow's story is already waiting in the shadows. Thanks for watching.